Welcome to the Business Model Sandbox, where leaders come to not just talk about, to explore and really dig into entire new business models, ways to transform customer value, not just small incremental changes to the way things work today, but entire new ways to create, deliver, and capture value. I'm Saul Kaplan, your host for the Business Model Sandbox podcast series and the founder and chief catalyst here at BIF. And each month, really fortunate to have a leading thinker and doer in the transformation space. These are people who aren't just talking about it, but are actually making it happen. And today, I couldn't be more excited to have my friend, Richie Etwaru. He's one of the most exciting young CEOs with a startup called Humanity.co. It's HUmanity.co. You're going to want to look at this after you've heard Richie today. He's pretty amazing, and there's so much we can learn from the way he's really, what I say, creating a movement, not just a company, but launching a movement, which I think the most exciting business models are. Richie, welcome to the Business Model Sandbox.
Thanks for having me, sir.
Oh, my goodness. Really excited about our conversation today. Let's start at the personal level, the anatomy of a movement. I often say that, a movement starts with a catalyst, and a leader often plays that role as a catalyst, and I see you doing that. Where does your passion to do this? We'll talk about the substance of what it is, but let's just start personally. Where does your passion and motivation come from? What experience brought you to, driving this incredible movement, trying to establish a 31st human right globally, for heaven's sakes?
Well, thanks for asking. It's a problem that has been bothering me for about 20 years. This is the amalgamation of a long, slow hunch, so to speak. Just really quick, I'm 43 now. At 22, I built my first company called License Monitor, which the business model was to buy driver records from the Department of Motor Vehicles across the United States of America and sell those driver records to trucking companies for them to comply with safety federal motor carrier regulations. And, I'm 22-year-old at the time. I was a green card holder. I'd raised a capital and I'd negotiated with DMVs across the country to get that data and sell it to companies like UPS. And I remember thinking to myself, Sal, I'm probably going to go to jail. Like there's something wrong here, right? I'm not the driver. I'm not the Department of Motor Vehicles. I'm not my customers. I hope they understand the Driver Privacy Protection Act. I kind of understand the Freedom of Information Act and the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And I'm seeing everybody speeding tickets and suspensions for not paying alimony, and I'm making significant margins on the data. And I thought to myself, man, it has to be illegal. Or this is the best country in the world. One of the two, right? And it was that insight. Now, I was getting myself out of poverty and my moral compass wasn't really properly developed. But that hunch 20 years ago, that at some point the source of this raw material, which is data, the source being the human being, has to be brought into the chain. And whether it's the value chain or the choice chain or the consent chain, they're left out of all of those dimensions. Now, that worked itself over the last 20 years. I operated P&Ls on Wall Street, P&Ls in healthcare. And as you watch the problem get bigger and bigger over time, one perspective is, man, you're never going to solve this. Or the other perspective is, in order to solve this, we've got to think about things differently, solve the problem at the top of the spear, at the human right level, and then at the same time express the evidence that this could work, right? So one part of it is a movement and the narrative and the policy and the advocacy. The other part is to lay down evidence and an expression of an industry model, right, where consumers, corporations, and governments can thrive. I'm happy to talk to you about that. But this is a problem that's been bothering me for 20 years. It's like an itch that's been itching you for 20 years, and eventually it boils over. And if you're wage independent, if you're lucky enough to be wage independent and you could take a risk and do something that you truly believe, that's kind of the phase I'm in right now.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Richie. It's evident every time that I hear you, that this is a purpose. It's a passion for you, and I think that's so important, this difference between starting a company and launching a movement, in a generative, organic way. There's always a personal story behind that, and people can emotionally connect with it. Let's dig in a little bit. Let's start. I want to admire the problem for just a couple of minutes here. I don't want to belabor it. Here at BIF, we have a mantra. We spend too much time admiring the problem and not enough time, modeling the solution. But everybody's talking about data privacy right now. We've got Facebook and all the hoopla around what's happening to all this data that we seem to have given away, and lamenting that. I'd like to hear your perspective, on the problem as it exists today. I like the history and how you got there. Bring it forward to today. How do you characterize the problem? How urgent? How bad is this?
So two dimensions. All right. The first dimension is to really think about data, not as a broad brush, but in different pieces. So if we were to plot a Pareto chart, okay, and the data sets that are not that valuable to you, that you probably don't want to control as much as you should, are on the right side of that Pareto chart. And on the left side of the Pareto chart are data sets that are incredibly valuable to you that you definitely want to control. On the right side of that chart are things like Facebook, your Facebook status or your update, and maybe your Google search habits. On the left side of that chart are things like your healthcare records, things like your geolocation data. What type of flowers did you purchase for your wife on Valentine's Day, right? And so when you plot that, you recognize that there's a huge problem over here that we don't focus on, that is not the social media data, right? It's these other data sets. And I think it's important for us to think about it that way. The second thing on that chart is to recognize that as on the right side of that chart, you're in a contract where you're getting consideration back. With Facebook, you're getting a platform to perpetuate your vanity. And with Google, you're getting a platform to collaborate while being snooped on, right? But with healthcare data on the left side of that chart, as an example, you have already paid for the transaction. You paid the doctor, you paid the pharmacist, you paid the labs, and it's a byproduct of that transaction that's being monetized many times by a partner of the doctor or a partner of the pharmacy that you're not even in contract with, right? So we have to make sure that we understand the shades of gray in the marketplace. I think that's the first thing. The second dimension to admire the problem just very slightly is to recognize that there are conversations around privacy, which is, I don't want you to learn personal things about me, regardless of whether you use my data or not, right? There are conversations around possession, which is, I want my data to have it myself. Now, in healthcare data, I don't want my healthcare data because I have slight hypochondria, so I'm perfectly happy not having access to it, right? And then there is the policy around it, which is, what does fair trade data look like? Right? What is fairness and balance? And then above that is sort of this tent that we call property. And we can talk about property and the implications of that. But we're in this posture right now where if we don't answer this question, regardless of whether the answer is the government owns the data, the corporations own the data, or the people own the data, if we don't answer this question, we're walking into the future somewhat blindly.
Yeah, so there's so much in that answer. I appreciate the distinction you made, although I wonder sometimes about the gray area in between. I mean, even on the social data, I half jokingly say, but not really joking, I wonder if the companies that are collecting all of that social media data, that you put over on the left-hand continuum, I'm not so sure that they don't know more about the health and well-being of me and my family than all the folks who actually get the healthcare data itself. And of course, all the stuff that's going on with Facebook and the social data and how those data are being used, right, in aggregate or individually, to manipulate a national election, for heaven's sakes. I mean, have really brought a lot of attention to this. And I don't know about you, but I see a lot of people that are pretty pissed off about this, the way these models are working.
Absolutely, right. It's an issue of a business model, right? There's an old business model that says, we'll give you a service for free and you're the product. Right. So it's an issue of a business model, and there are new business models that are emerging. Many of those are not necessarily prioritizing ethics, but they're prioritizing economics. right? The issue is boiling over to a point where the public is now calling for ethics around this. And whenever the public wants something, it means that's good economics. So, for example, as we're deploying in healthcare, right, pharma is the biggest buyer of healthcare data in the healthcare industry. The pharmaceutical industry is actually excited to, for the first time, have the opportunity to have a direct, explicit relationship with human beings at scale. They've never been offered this. They've always been offered de-identified data that came through a supply chain that came with a tremendous amount of regulatory and compliance overhead on it, and the data quality is not as good as it could be, as well as they could only use it for narrow purposes. So there's a business model here where you can have better compliance, you can have a better brand posture in the marketplace, and you can have better quality data if you're willing to respect the source. It's not just a social cause or an ethical cause. There's actually good economics behind this.
Yeah, so we don't call this the Business Model Sandbox for nothing. You're absolutely right about thinking about these models, and some of the existing ones are going to have to change. Let's start specifically around the data and your premise, where if I understand what you're trying to do, you're trying to establish the 31st human right, the list of United Nations, 30 human rights that have been around for a long time. Lord knows we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we actually have those human rights evenly around the world and in an equitable way. You want to add the 31st one around data as property. Tell me about that. Why did you go there? Why did you go to the human right level?
Yeah, so the issue itself has broad-reaching implications. The issue of the ownership of data. So this pattern that we're playing out, Saul, which is to get consumers to collectively act together to take ownership or agency of something that is inherently ours. That's the pattern we're playing out here, right? This is not the first time this pattern is being played out in the history of our species. In the 1600s, we saw the pattern play out around our creativity, right? Prior to 1620s, if you were author and you read a book, it's not yours, right? And we saw the early action from artists, who were called starving artists at the time, to say, hey, we need an economic model here to substantiate art, right? And now we have beautiful things like intellectual property laws and patents and trademarks and all that type of stuff. So we got control of our creativity. That's a pattern. The second time the pattern played out was around our productivity, around labor. And I think that's recent enough and it's been written about enough, so we don't need to discuss that. We're simply playing out the same pattern again around our data. And what's important to understand is that there are some Goldilocks conditions that has to be in place from a timing perspective for one to create such macro socioeconomic course correction, right? And those are, one is the current state has to actually start to affect the sustainability of the species. Right? With creativity, like art is important to our social fabric, right? With productivity, like slavery was not going to substantiate us all the way through, right? So that's the first. The second is public opinion has to boil over on the matter, right? And we both know what happened there. And third is you have to have some sort of solution that brings communities, corporations, and governments to a place where everybody feels like they're winning, right? And property law does that with data because communities can benefit, corporations can have better quality data and better compliance, and governments gets to tax the income. So when you think about the size of the issue and the historic socioeconomic implications of it, it's really irresponsible to define it as a big data problem or a privacy problem or a healthcare data problem. If you look at the matter at the top of the stack, the issue is that as a human being, I don't have property rights around data that comes off my body. So we wanted to solve it there.
I love that framing. I think it gives us all a way to see how we map, to that. But now come back down to the ground. How do I assert my human right? And how do I do that in a world that doesn't seem to recognize it, with all of those business models around, institutional players and actors, that seem to be going in the other direction?
Yeah, one of the things that I think we always tend to forget is that the human beings are very, very powerful when they act in a coordinated fashion, Okay. Most of the human rights that we have right now are top down, which is they were sort of given to us, right? And they're addressing issues that are from the past. And by the way, there are still issues that those human rights have to address, but most of those problems are getting smaller and smaller over time, right? Like human trafficking is bad, but it's getting a little smaller over time. This issue of us not having ownership of our data, the problem is expanding over time, right? Taking it down to the ground as opposed to how do we act. What we essentially do is we manufacture the corridor, the legal corridor for an individual to claim property rights around their data on our app. Okay, and then on top of that, you set your consent and your authorization and your data preferences, which is how you'd like your data to be collected. That's actually not that interesting and exciting. It's hard work to do that, but it's not interesting and exciting. What's interesting and exciting is that we then pool large groups of consumers and act in what we call collective renegotiation. Think about it as an intersection of collective bargaining and a class action lawsuit with companies that are currently collecting and selling the data and working as a collective to encourage them to mark that data for fair trade with the title ID of ownership so that when that data is sold downstream and pharma, for example, buys that data, they now have a unique identifier and for the first time the opportunity to check the permissions of those individuals to figure out whether they're in or out of the deal. Right. So the expression of it in healthcare, as it's expressed as a technology and a business model, really requires on collective action. And what's super surprising to us is that people are gravitating to this faster than we anticipated. We have about 5,000 people on a beta in our application. That's a big beta for a small company, right? Which means that they signed up voluntarily, right? We didn't coerce them into do that. We're estimating that it's only going to cost us about $5 to convert each consumer onto the app, which is a really low conversion cost, right? So the expression of it really comes from a place of collective action.
And do you have examples, even at a small scale now, where you have the consumer interest in asserting the right, but now that's only as good as the other parts of that market, the institutional players that you're trying to change the equation about, it's my data, how can you use it? Do I get compensated for your access to it? Are there examples where those multi-sided markets exist at a small scale?
Well, there is, but specifically for our market, we've seen an unusual set of demand from the pharmaceutical industry.
Okay.
So I've now personally spoken to VPs or SVPs at about 18 of the top 20 pharma companies in the world as inbound on this matter. And the matter is essentially, hey, there's three different dimensions to it. One is we're really, really eager to understand how we can have a transparent adult relationship at scale with human beings. We've never had this before. This is fascinating, okay? Two is we really want to be in a different compliance posture. So one of the challenges with the healthcare data stream, which doesn't exist in financial services, is that when it's hijacked, so to speak, in the business associate agreement by the EMR, EHR companies. I don't know how much you understand HIPAA. Okay, so you feel me, right?
I feel you.
When it's hijacked and de-identified, right? The burden on pharma is to prove that they cannot re-identify the patient. Okay, and with the more data sets that we continue to buy and the longitudinal patient records that we continue to build, it's becoming increasingly difficult to continue to say that you can't re-identify that that's Richie Etwaru, right? So there's a desire to be in a better compliance posture around this, to have that explicit relationship at scale. And third,
what an interesting use case. Are they how broad or narrow are they? Are they thinking about it initially in the clinical trial space? Where are they thinking about it? This is my home industry, by the way. So yeah, I definitely feel you.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag, right? So some of the companies that are purely pharmaceutical, right, are obviously thinking about R&D as the primary use case, whereas clinical trials are not. But some of the companies that are multinationals that have consumer arms as well are looking at it as, for the first time, a mechanism to have a relationship at scale, right, with the consumer. One of the pressures in the healthcare market is to recognize that the experience between the pharmaceutical companies and consumers is just not there. There's no relationship. Right, and with the entry of things like Amazon, et cetera, that experience is about to be stolen. And so these companies are really interested in having a better posture in that relationship. I think what's most promising, though, is that we have a few pharma companies, Sal, who are willing to show their demand. So we've had a few pharma companies who have said, look, we're looking for these types of people with these types of behavior sets, and we're willing to pay X amount, okay, for an explicit relationship with these people at scale, which means that the demand is standing up on the industry model as fast as the supply is standing up. So we're very promised by it. But the proof will be in the pudding.
I really love the example, and if I understand it, this rides on a blockchain infrastructure. For our audience, just talk briefly about how it's an enabling technology. Of all the emerging technologies that we talk about, and everything that we get excited about, blockchain, still remains the enigma, right? Like, we're starting to understand the power of AI, and some of these other emerging technologies, but I think people still struggle with what blockchain can do. Why is it important to what you're trying to do?
Yeah. So really, really quick, anything that you can do with blockchain, you could do without blockchain. It'll just be 10 times more difficult, and it'll probably take 10 times more time. Okay. So the first thing to recognize from blockchain is that if you have a network of companies that have to see something the same way or transact together, using blockchain, which has the ability to make sure you have sanctity of the data and each copy of that data knows how to find consensus, is actually faster and cheaper. Right? I think a lot of people miss that point. They tend to come at it from the cryptocurrency perspective or the security perspective. But the fact that it's faster and cheaper because integration is built in and you don't have to worry about all those ETL jobs and Informatica licenses, right? I think that's the first thing. So that's one of the reasons that we use it. But more poignant, and while our stack includes a lot of things, what the IBM blockchain, so we're using IBM Hyperledger in our stack, what it does for us is we're putting consumers through KYC, right? We have to know that you are who you are, and it's not your dog trying to lease your data to a pharmaceutical company, right? We're attaching legal documents for you to claim property rights on your data. We're giving you a title of ownership with a date and time stamp. You're setting your consent and authorization around that, and then preferences. And then pharma checks that, and if both people are agreed to be in an explicit relationship, we're facilitating lease transactions on top of that, where money is moved back and forth. And then we have to give pharma the Office of Civil Rights reports for HIPAA compliance that says, I have the explicit consent and authorization for Sal to be able to use his data in this way. That infrastructure of having that Cartesian product of leases, okay, and beginning and ends and rights and use and consent is not something that you want to take lightly. This is not the type of infrastructure that you want to be hackable or editable or adjustable. And this is not the type of infrastructure where if you built it on a non-blockchain, it would be so much of a lift for the pharma from a B2B side. We just found it to be a better fit. Now, if you take that out, which is our use case, blockchain itself does something really interesting, which is also one of our character flaws, which is we're not good at agreeing. And blockchain is a really good way for us to build agreements at scale. It's the first time we have a technology that helps us build agreement. And so the first hypothesis that you see is, let's see if we can all agree on what a currency is, right? And that hypothesis continues to ongo. We're sort of treating it as, let's see if we can agree how HIPAA should be interpreted.
I love the healthcare examples here. Obviously, it's my personal home industry. My most recent passion project called Personalized Medicine by Design is trying to imagine a healthcare world and a model where individuals and families are at the core, and health and well-being is driving, the information flow, the way we access tools, the way we access health professionals, in a way that I suppose could be seen as disruptive to the existing structure. So obviously what you're doing is very, very interesting to me, particularly given all the new data streams coming along. I mean, we're pretty close to all of us being able to access our genomic information, at a price point, maybe even free, with some of these platforms. And I really worry about some of these platforms, doing what Facebook did. Will you give us your genomic information and we'll give you access to this platform, and then the next thing you know, we wake up and they've sold our personal genomic data, never mind our social media preferences, our actual genome. And so this is why I think the work you're doing and what humanity is trying to do is so important.
Yeah, so I just want to make a point. The point around DNA data is a very, very poignant one, right? And everything we've talked about so far is the history and the present. Let's just talk very quickly about the future, right? So, yes, there are elements of fair trade within data. There are elements of privacy, etc. But the issue that worries me the most, and why I believe that we need property rights to be able to control the data, is that fine, a company might use our data without our permission. Yes, that's inequitable, okay? But at some point, algorithms, or what I would like to call digital gods, are going to understand us in a way better than we understand ourselves, okay? And we've been told for a long time, thou shalt know thyself, right? And so you meditate and try to know yourself, and the only person that sort of knows you better is your mom, right? But in a world where human beings who control algorithms can know you better than you know yourself, right? There's a really great example I like to quote, which is there's an algorithm that can look at your eye movement in a crowd over a period of time and predict with a fair amount of confidence where you are on the spectrum of straight to gay, if you don't know, okay? And that's a really poignant example, but it's not the most dangerous one. So when we get to a point where some human being who has power understands us in mass better than we understand ourselves because of all these data points, how can we hold them accountable to not manipulate us to the extent where they potentially domesticate us? Okay? And that's where I see this being an issue of a humanitarian issue. I mean, we don't have a track record of being kind to things that we understand better than they understand themselves. Like, we domesticated the goat, we domesticated the cow, we domesticated the dog, right? But many times using the dog to domesticate the others. So how do we make sure that we don't get into a situation where we get manipulated to the extent where we're partially domesticated? And that's why we need control over this issue now, because it's coming at us fast.
I love the passion there. What a dramatic way, to get our attention around this data, this notion of, I wonder how many of us feel like if we're not domesticated already after the industrial era happened to us, and to try to work our way out of that with all these new technologies, it's just so important, and healthcare is just one of the many areas that we could focus on. Briefly tell me about your business model, humanity's business model. So as you're exploring putting these markets together and building the infrastructure for that, how do you capture value from that, and how are you going to scale it?
Our business model is simple but unusual. We are one of the only companies in the world that only gets paid when our customers get paid. So what we do is we facilitate leasing transactions. For those consumers that are willing to be in an explicit lease with a buyer, we facilitate leasing transactions. So we're track and trace over a data marketplace, right, that doesn't have transparency right now. And the consensus that we're seeing from the pharma industry is about $10 per month for the individuals that they want to lease their data for annually. So it's about $120 a year, right? Which is not significant to certain segments of the country, but very significant to other segments of the country. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you're interesting to Pfizer, you're probably interesting to GSK as well. So you may have two companies leasing you at the same time in a Cartesian product. Providing that service for pharma, we get a fee from pharma once that transaction is made. So unless consumers get paid for the explicit consent and authorization to use their data, we don't get paid. Our business model extracts value after the customer gets paid.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I can't help but think as I'm listening to you, and this personalized medicine by design project really drives me there, to be, making sure that me as a consumer, about not just asserting my right, but making sure that I'm represented fully in that market, right? And that I'm not overwhelmed. The minute people hear, big pharma, I grew up there, I worked in big pharma, but I'm surrounded by people who, the minute they hear that, their backbone goes up a little bit, and they get a little nervous about it. So I'm encouraged by what you said about them wanting to imagine different ways to connect And we know they've always connected with intermediaries rather than us as end users. So that's encouraging, but I'm still not seeing the business model change within pharma, that I hope for. And I wonder if we as consumers aren't going to drive more of that as I get access to more of this data and I get more leverage over those institutional conversations. Is that wrong-headed?
No, it's not at all. So I think there's a bit of industry model change, and then there's business model change, right? So the industry model is what we've talked about so far. Pharma specifically, if you think about the portfolio, the R&D portfolio, right? We're seeing less and less blockbuster opportunities within the R&D portfolio and more specialty portfolios, right? And those specialty portfolios are lower, I'm talking about indicators in the portfolio, right? So drugs. Those are lower volume, higher priced, okay? And they require a certain cohort of people and a certain depth of relationship to understand specialty drugs. So I think as we see the pharma business model move from blockbuster drugs to specialty drugs, there is a demand for an intimate relationship with humans at scale. And this facilitates that transition to a bit of a hands-off approach to making drugs, to a more of an arm's length approach to making drugs. That's the big business model shift that we're assisting within the pharmaceutical industry.
I totally agree with you. Yeah. I think it could even go further. You see this in oncology, as kind of a leading edge indicator here, where it's not even just smaller scale production; it's personalized production. Based on understanding my genome and other information that allows me to actually customize it, which disrupts and changes everything through R&D, clinical development, and regulatory. So it's good to hear you getting out ahead of that.
I'll share with you a little data point. I have allergies, and sometimes my allergies are not as bad as I'd like to. I literally take a file and file down the Zyrtec because I don't need the whole thing that day, right? Yeah. That's my own version of personalized medicine, right?
No, it's a good example.
One of the things that is important that I think don't get enough attention, Sal, and I'd like to bring some attention to it, is a lot of people talk about personalized medicine and about that type of stuff. That requires commons. It requires data commons to study. And what we're doing is we're giving people the choice to say, I am permitting my data to be used for good in the commons, and in the marketplace, I want compensation for it. And that's a beautiful thing, because most of the true consumers of the data in the commons don't have access to the data, right? Most of the popular precision medicine initiatives, not like yours, are actually commercial companies hiding under a commons facade. And so we're super excited about consumers being able to deliberately and explicitly say, I want my data to be used for true initiatives that are nonprofit, that for the benefit of the commons. Because right now, the commons is starved because the data has a price on it.
Let's conclude the conversation. I want to give you the chance to come back and talk to our audience. We're loaded with a lot of geeks like me, or geek wannabes, that love the detailed nuance of what you're doing. But bring it up now to folks maybe not geeks. Like, what should I do? What can I do? How do I assert my right? How do I play a role? Like, should I get engaged directly in what you're talking about here today?
So I think there's two dimensions. Number one is you should get on the app. You should claim your data as your property, join the movement so that we can grow the critical mass. That's number one, okay? And encourage other people to get into the data hustle, right? As we like to call it, right? I grew up in Queens, right? Everybody has a hustle. Queens, New York, right? The second point is that there's a bit of an education. So our narrative so far has hit sort of the high IQ, high-powered kind of crowd, right? There's a bit of an education for the SVP, CEO level to be able to recognize that the issue of fair trade data is going to become as important as the ethics that are in your algorithms. So by the time this makes the web, this would have already been announced. We're working with the IEEE to build a standards recommendation body around fair trade data, which is the sister effort around AI ethics, so that companies can now be able to say, look, my algorithms are 3-star rated when it comes to ethics, but my data is 5-star rated when it comes to fair trade, right? Kind of like your car. You could have a car that's really, really efficient, but you put crappy gasoline in it, or you could have a car that's not efficient, but you put really good gasoline in it from a carbon emissions perspective. So I think there's an education to join the movement on the left-hand side in the data hustle, but there is also a mid to high IQ conversation to be had to understand that there is good business in fair trade data. It won't be long, Sal, before the Cambridge Analytica of the pharmaceutical industry happens. It won't be long before the Cambridge Analytica of the financial services industry happens. So these CEOs and senior vice presidents, the ones that we haven't gotten to as yet, we need our community, guys like you and myself, to be able to start to advocate that this is not just good social stuff, this is good business.
Well, Richie, first of all, thank you for joining me in the Business Model Sandbox. I'm in. I'm going to go sign up for the app to assert my right and to just stay close and watch what you're doing. Check out this website and what Richie and the team at Humanity are doing, HUmanity.co. Check out the site, sign up for the app. Richie, I can't thank you enough. It's so exciting and I think so important to get our arms around it. And I'm glad you and the folks at Humanity are doing it. Thanks.
My pleasure.